In 2002, a consortium of geneticists launched a project that had never been attempted at that scale before. They called it the Human Genome Diversity Project, and its goal was almost absurdly ambitious. Collect DNA from over 1,000 people, spread across more than 50 populations on every inhabited continent, then use that data to reconstruct the entire genetic history of our species. Every migration, every split, every mixing event going back tens of thousands of years. It sounded, to more than a few skeptical scientists at the time, like trying to reconstruct a shattered mirror using only the light bouncing off its remaining shards. Technically plausible, but almost impossibly delicate work. By the late 2000s, the data was in, and researchers ran the numbers, through computer models designed to sort human populations by genetic similarity. The results for almost every group on the planet made perfect sense. Northern Europeans clustered tightly with other Northern Europeans. Han Chinese clustered with other East Asians. Sub-Saharan Africans showed the deepest and most varied genetic roots of any population on Earth, exactly as scientists expected if humanity began there. Every population fit onto a branching tree that mapped cleanly onto known history, confirming decades of archaeological guesswork with hard genetic proof. Every population except one. Buried in the data was a group of people whose genome refused to cooperate. They did not fit next to their geographic neighbors. They did not fit into any known migration pattern. Researchers reran the analysis, checked for contamination, and suspected a sample error, the kind of thing that happens more often than most published papers ever admit. But the anomaly held, and when researchers dug deeper into their chromosomes, they found genetic material that should not have existed anywhere on Earth in the 21st century. Fragments belonging to a human species that vanished from the fossil record tens of thousands of years ago. This is the story of how scientists tried to map the DNA history of every population on the planet, and the one group of people who broke the entire model. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we publish new genetic history documentaries every week, and this is one of the strangest stories that global DNA mapping has ever produced. If you stay until the end, you will understand something about human ancestry that most textbooks still get wrong. To understand why this one population broke the model, you first need to understand how the model was built in the first place. Genetic mapping projects like the Human Genome Diversity Project work by comparing small variations in DNA, called single nucleotide polymorphisms, across thousands of individuals. The more genetic variants two populations share, and the more recently their lineages split apart, the closer they sit on the tree. Using this method, geneticists reconstructed the outline of the human story with remarkable precision. Homo sapiens first appeared in East Africa, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Tall, slender, with rounded skulls and high foreheads, anatomically identical to the people reading this right now. For well over 100,000 years, our ancestors stayed there, spreading slowly across the African continent and forming deep genetic branches that still exist today in groups like the San peoples of southern Africa and the Mbuti of the Congo rainforest. These populations carry the oldest and most diverse human DNA on the planet, and whenever geneticists want to find the root of the human family tree, that is where they look. Then, somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, a small band of humans, likely no more than a few thousand people, left Africa for good. They crossed the Sinai Peninsula or the narrow strait at the mouth of the Red Sea, and they walked into a world that was already occupied. Not by animals, by other humans, different humans. In the river valleys and forests of Europe and Western Asia, they encountered the Neanderthals, a stocky, cold-adapted species that had already been living there for 400,000 years. The two groups did not simply pass each other by. They competed for territory, they likely fought at times, and they had children together. That is not speculation anymore. It is written directly into living DNA. Every person of European or Asian descent today carries somewhere between 1% and 2% Neanderthal ancestry, a genetic signature left behind by encounters that happened tens of thousands of years before anyone could write it down. Africans whose ancestors never left the continent during that migration carry almost none of it, which is itself one of the clearest proofs of the out-of-Africa model. But Neanderthals were only the first surprise. In 2010, a research team working in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a site called Denisovan cave, extracted DNA from a tiny fragment of a finger bone. What they found didn't match modern humans, and it didn't match Neanderthals either. It belonged to an entirely new branch of the human family, one science had never identified before. Researchers named them the Denisovans, and to this day, the entire physical fossil record for this species amounts to a finger. Bone, a handful of teeth, and part of a jaw discovered in Tibet years later. That's it. And yet, from those fragments, scientists managed to sequence a complete genome, and when they compared it to modern populations around the world, the results were bizarre. The highest concentrations of Denisovan DNA on the planet were not found anywhere near Siberia. They were found thousands of miles south, in Papua New Guinea, in Aboriginal Australian communities, and across the islands of Melanesia, where modern populations carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan ancestry. That is more than 20 times the trace amounts found in mainland East Asia, close to where the actual bones were dug up. Something about that distribution did not add up, and it was the first hint that the standard model of human migration had a serious blind spot. That blind spot became impossible to ignore once researchers turned their attention to a small, remote island chain in the Bay of Bengal. The Andaman Islands sit roughly halfway between India and Myanmar, a scatter of more than 500 tropical islands, most of them uninhabited and covered in dense rainforest. For tens of thousands of years, the people who lived there had essentially no contact with the outside world. No trade routes reached them, no empire ever conquered them, no outside religion ever converted them. They lived exactly as their ancestors had, hunting wild pigs with bows and fishing the shallow coastal waters with hand-woven nets. When European sailors first encountered them in the late 1700s, they were stunned. The Andamanese looked nothing like the populations of mainland India just a few hundred miles away. They stood short, often under 5 feet tall, with very dark skin and tightly coiled hair. To 18th century Europeans, they looked as though they belonged in Africa, despite living on the opposite side of the Indian Ocean, surrounded on every side by populations that looked entirely different from them. For 2 centuries, anthropologists argued endlessly about who these people actually were. Some assumed they were descendants of shipwrecked African slaves. Others believed they were a relic population, the last living survivors of a much older migration that had been wiped out or absorbed everywhere else on Earth. Without genetic evidence, none of it could be settled. It was all guesswork dressed up as theory. Then, in the early 2000s, researchers finally managed to sequence usable DNA from members of the Andamanese tribes, and the results reshaped an entire field. The Andamanese were not African. They were not closely related to mainland Indians, despite living within their territorial waters. And they were barely related to anyone alive today. Genetically speaking, they turned out to be one of the most isolated human populations ever discovered, and buried in their genome was something researchers could not immediately explain. The first wave of analysis showed the Andamanese lineage split off from the rest of humanity somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago, placing them squarely within that very first wave of modern humans who walked out of Africa and began moving east along the southern coastline of Asia. Everywhere else on Earth, that original wave had been diluted, overwritten, or replaced entirely by later arrivals. Farming populations expanding out of the Fertile Crescent, steppe herders sweeping in from Central Asia, the Bantu expansion reshaping the genetic map of Africa, wave after wave of newer migrations burying the signal of those very first travelers. But on the Andaman Islands, isolated by open ocean for tens of thousands of years, that original signal survived almost untouched. The Andamanese are, in a very real sense, a living window into what the earliest non-African humans looked like, genetically speaking, before nearly every other population on the planet got mixed, replaced, or reshaped. That discovery alone would have justified a research career. But there was more waiting inside their chromosomes. When scientists dug further into the Andamanese genome, they found sequences that did not belong to modern humans, and did not belong to Neanderthals either. They were Denisovan, the same archaic lineage first identified from a finger bone 3,000 miles to the north in Siberia. And it wasn't a faint trace. The Andamanese carried substantial Denisovan ancestry, in some measurements rivaling the levels found in the populations of New Guinea. Under the existing model, this made no sense at all. Denisovans were supposed to have lived in Siberia and possibly parts of East Asia, with their DNA entering the modern gene pool somewhere in that region and then traveling south with later migrations into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But the Andamanese had been sealed off on their islands for tens of thousands of years with essentially no genetic exchange with anyone. So how did Denisovan DNA get in there in the first place? There was really only one explanation that fit the evidence. Denisovans must have lived far further south than anyone had assumed, likely across large parts of Southeast Asia, including areas that are now Indonesia, the Philippines, and the surrounding region. When the first wave of modern humans passed through that territory on their journey east, they met Denisovan populations there and interbred with them directly, not somewhere far to the north. Those mixed populations then split apart, with some ending up isolated on the Andaman Islands and others continuing on to become the ancestors of modern Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. This single finding rewrote a chunk of prehistory. Denisovans were not some small, cold, adapted population confined to a single Siberian mountain range. They were a sprawling, adaptable species that ranged across freezing taiga and humid equatorial jungle alike, surviving for hundreds of thousands of years across a territory that, by some estimates, stretched more than 5,000 miles, larger than the range of any living great ape species today. And we have almost nothing physical to show for it. A finger bone, a few teeth, a fragment of jaw. That is the entire skeletal record of a species that occupied a continent for most of human prehistory. Everything else we know about the Denisovans, we know because of the genetic echoes they left behind and the people who absorbed them before disappearing entirely. The Andamanese were not simply a relic population sitting quietly on the edge of the genetic map. They were living proof that an entire chapter of human history had gone missing from the textbooks, and the deeper researchers looked, the stranger the story became. In 2018, a separate research team analyzing Denisovan ancestry across different modern populations discovered that the Denisovan DNA found in Papuans and Aboriginal Australians did not come from a single source. There were at least two genetically distinct Denisovan populations that contributed to modern humans, and they had themselves split apart from each other at least 280,000 years earlier. They were different enough that some researchers began referring to them as separate groups altogether. One was the classic Denisovan lineage, matching the population identified from the Siberian cave. The other was something else, a southern Denisovan population that had lived across Southeast Asia and contributed heavily to the Andamanese, Papuan, and Australian gene pools. In other words, the human family tree was never really a tree at all. It was closer to a tangled network, a web of different hominin populations meeting, mixing, and splitting apart repeatedly across hundreds of thousands of years. And the Andamanese sat right at the center of one of the densest tangles in that web, carrying inherited fragments from at least two extinct human species that exist nowhere else on the planet today. Even that was not the strangest part of the story. When geneticists examined the deepest, oldest layers of Andamanese DNA, the segments that matched neither modern humans nor Neanderthals nor Denisovans, they found small fragments that did not match anything in any existing genetic database. Not a known modern population, not a known archaic human, nothing. These fragments were ancient, deeply diverged from everything else on record and completely unidentifiable. Researchers began calling this kind of material ghost DNA, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Genetic material inherited from a population we have never identified, whose bones have never been found, but whose signature is still quietly present in the cells of living people today. The Andamanese carry ghost sequences from at least one unknown hominin population that contributed to their ancestry tens of thousands of years ago, and then vanished so completely that not a single confirmed fossil of it has ever surfaced. We do not know what these people looked like. We do not know exactly where they lived. We do not even know for certain what species they belonged to. All we know is that they existed, because a fingerprint of their DNA is still walking around today, carried by a few hundred people on a remote chain of islands in the Bay of Bengal. Sit with that for a second. At some point, deep in prehistory, possibly 60 or 70,000 years ago, the ancestors of the Andamanese encountered yet another group of humans. Not Neanderthals, not Denisovans, something else entirely, a population that walked upright, likely made tools, possibly had its own spoken language, and lived somewhere in South or Southeast Asia. The two groups met. They interbred, children were born, and then, at some point after that, the other population disappeared completely. Every individual, every settlement, every physical trace of its existence erased by time. The only thing left of them is a scattering of DNA fragments inside a small number of living people. If those specific bloodlines die out, the last confirmed evidence that this population ever walked the earth disappears along with them. And here is where the story becomes genuinely current. As recently as the summer of this year, a team of researchers, using a brand new computational method that reconstructs ancestral relationships directly from patterns in modern genomes, rather than relying on ancient DNA samples, identified yet another ghost lineage hiding inside every single modern human population studied, not just isolated island groups. This lineage appears to have interbred with our ancestors in Africa more than 50,000 years ago, before the last major migration out of the continent, and its genetic fingerprint makes up somewhere around 1% of the DNA of every person alive today, a proportion comparable to the amount of Neanderthal ancestry carried by people of European or Asian descent. The same research also flagged evidence of what scientists are now calling a super-archaic ancestor, a hominin, lineage that appears to have split off from the rest of the human family more than 1 million years ago, and later interbred with Denisovans in Eurasia, passing its own genetic material down through them, and eventually into modern humans. None of these populations have ever been found as fossils. Every scrap of evidence for their existence comes from patterns buried inside the DNA of the billions of people alive right now. It means the ghost lineage story is not confined to one remote island chain in the Bay of Bengal. It is written into the genome of essentially every human being on the planet. just in far smaller, far more diluted concentrations than what survived in isolated populations like the Andamanese. This is not the only ghost lineage that has turned up elsewhere either. Separate studies looking at West African populations have identified another distinct archaic contribution woven into ancestry there, distinct from anything found in Europe, Asia, or Oceania. Central African pygmy populations carry yet another signature of their own. Piece by piece, researchers are discovering that these genetic ghosts are scattered across almost every branch of the Gia human family, fingerprints at a scene where the identity of the person who left them may never be confirmed. Which brings us back to why the Andamanese specifically broke the global genetic mapping project. They are not a clean branch sitting quietly on the human family tree. They are a fusion point, a place where multiple lineages collided, including at least 2 confirmed extinct populations and possibly a third or fourth that science has not yet been able to name. Every Andamanese person alive today is, in a very literal genetic sense, walking around as a living archive of human prehistory, carrying inherited fragments of encounters that happened tens of thousands of years before the first city was built anywhere on Earth. If you're finding this as strange as we did while researching it, take a second to hit that like button. It genuinely helps push this video out to more people who are curious about where we actually came from. And stick around, because the story gets even more urgent from here. There are only a few hundred Andamanese left alive today across 4 remaining tribal groups. When the British colonized the islands in the 1850s, the combined indigenous population was estimated somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 people spread across multiple tribes, including the Great Andamanese, the Onge, the Jarawa, and the Sentinelese. Within 50 years, sustained contact with outsiders introduced diseases the islanders had no immunity to at all: measles, influenza, syphilis. The Great Andamanese population collapsed from thousands down to a tiny fraction of that, and today they number around 50 people. The Onge are estimated at roughly 100. The Jarawa, who only made peaceful contact with the outside world in 1998, number somewhere around 400. And the Sentinelese, who live on their own small island and have violently rejected all outside contact for centuries, are believed to number somewhere between 50 and 200 people, though no census has ever been possible because anyone who approaches their shoreline is met with arrows. What that means, practically speaking, is that the only people on Earth who carry this exact combination of ancient human ancestry, including ghost lineages science still cannot fully identify, could be gone within a single generation. One disease outbreak, one natural disaster, one poorly considered policy decision, and with them would go the last unbroken genetic record of multiple extinct human species, encoded nowhere else on the planet. The Indian government appears to understand the stakes here. The Andaman Islands are now a protected zone, and the Sentinelese in particular are legally off limits to any outside contact whatsoever. In 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chow ignored those protections and attempted to make contact with the tribe directly. He was killed within hours of stepping onto the beach, and his body could not be recovered. Indian authorities chose not to pursue charges against the tribe, explaining publicly that the Sentinelese were acting in self-defense of their own territory, and that any attempt at retaliation would only expose the tribe to greater risk of outside disease and disruption. So the Sentinelese remain exactly where they are, isolated on their island, living essentially as their ancestors did 50,000 years ago. They hunt with bows and arrows, they build small dugout canoes, they speak a language that has never been recorded or translated by any outsider. And somewhere inside their cells, they carry the genetic memory of at least one, and possibly several, human species that disappeared from the rest of the world before agriculture had even been invented anywhere on the planet. Satellite imagery of their island shows small jungle clearings where settlements sit, thin threads of smoke rising from cooking fires, and occasionally the tiny silhouette of a figure on the beach holding a spear, watching the horizon. After the devastating Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, a helicopter flew a low pass over the island, simply to check whether the tribe had survived the disaster. A Sentinelese man emerged from the tree line and fired an arrow directly at the aircraft. That was taken as confirmation that the tribe was still alive. No further contact was attempted. No aid was offered. No supplies were dropped. Indian officials concluded, even in the aftermath of a catastrophe that killed close to 250,000 people across the region, that the safest thing for the tribe was to be left entirely alone. The broader implications of what the Andamanese genome revealed are still being worked through by researchers around the world. Geneticists are now actively searching other isolated populations for similar ghost signals: small highland communities in Papua New Guinea, remote groups deep in the Amazon basin, hunter-gatherer populations in Central Africa. In several of these populations, researchers have already turned up comparable signals, unidentified DNA fragments echoing extinct human relatives whose stories disappeared along with their bones. What all of this adds up to is a fairly uncomfortable conclusion for anyone who learned a simplified version of human evolution in school. We were never the only intelligent human species walking the planet. For the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, the world contained other kinds of people. Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans stretching from frozen Siberia down into the tropics of Southeast Asia. Unnamed ghost populations in places researchers have not even pinpointed yet. They lived alongside our direct ancestors. They competed with them for territory and resources. In some cases, they had children with them. And one by one, every single one of those populations disappeared, absorbed, displaced, or lost to time, leaving behind nothing but scattered fragments of DNA inside the people who mixed with them. The Andamanese represent the single most concentrated, most intact example of that mixing found anywhere on Earth. They are not a primitive population, and they are not a pure, untouched one either. They are a living archive of everything mainstream human history forgot to include. When researchers study their genome, they are effectively reading a record of encounters between entirely different human species, encounters that happened tens of thousands of years before any city existed, any language was written down, or any god was ever worshipped by anyone. And that record is genuinely fragile. Andamanese languages are dying out. Traditional knowledge is fading with each passing year. The populations themselves are tiny, isolated, and vulnerable to a single bad event. If they disappear, humanity loses more than a group of people. It loses direct access to a chapter of its own origin story that scientists are only just beginning to read properly. In 2020, a group of researchers published a paper in the journal Nature that included a quiet but significant recommendation buried in its discussion section. They argued that the genomes of small, isolated populations like the Andamanese should be fully sequenced and permanently preserved in international genetic databases, not for any commercial application, but simply as a record of human prehistory belonging to the species as a whole. They compared the potential loss to the burning of the Library of Alexandria, except in this case, the books are written in DNA, and the knowledge they hold stretches back hundreds of thousands of years rather than a few centuries. That preservation work is now happening. Slowly, and with the consent of the communities involved, the great Andamanese have allowed researchers to collect samples for long-term genetic preservation. The Onge have taken part in similar studies. The Jarawa, in limited and carefully managed contact, have permitted some research to proceed. The Sentinelese remain completely untouched and unstudied, their genome an open question that may simply never be answered. If you have ever taken one of those consumer DNA ancestry tests and noticed a small, unexplained percentage labeled as ancient or unassigned, ancestry, this is a piece of the reason why. Scientists are still discovering who our ancestors actually were, and every new ghost, lineage identified in modern genomes, chips away at the old, tidy version of the human family tree most of us grew up believing in. That tree is not really a tree at all. It is closer to a forest, dense, tangled, with branches that cross and merge and disappear in places we still cannot fully map. And the Andaman Islands remain one of the last places on Earth where you can still see that entire forest, concentrated in one spot, quietly surviving inside the cells of a few hundred people on a remote chain of islands at the edge of the Indian Ocean. They are the population that broke the global genetic mapping project. They are living proof that the story of human origins taught in most classrooms is, at best, incomplete, and with every year that passes, they are running out of time to tell the rest of it. If this changed the way you think about human ancestry, drop a comment with the part that surprised you the most, and subscribe, because next week we're covering another population whose DNA suggests an origin story that mainstream science still cannot fully explain. You will not want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.